The Universal Studios Tour has been a staple of the theme park industry, leading to the creation of the whole Universal theme park brand. The Studio Tour has been entertaining guests for over 60 years and has been showcased in several films and television shows. The tour takes people through one of the most famous movie studios in the world and gives them an educational and sometimes thrilling view into how movies get made. It is both a real-life look into a working 415-acre studio backlot, where sometimes you might see actual movies being shot, and a theme park ride with themed elements to keep the tour exciting and fun. It has always been evolving and changing, so today I thought we would look into the history of the Universal Studios Tour and see if after 60 years, it still holds up to what it used to be. To start this story, we'll have to go back to the year 1914, during the very beginnings of the Hollywood studio system. Carl Laemmle, a New York filmmaker, just bought the Taylor Estate, a large property in the San Fernando Valley, for just $3,500. Adjusted for today's inflation, that is over $100,000. Once Carl had Universal built, he wanted to drive attention to the studio, so he held a grand opening for the public where he wanted to display the joys and wonders of filmmaking to general audiences. He dubbed Universal his movie city, and guests would flock to come check out the grand opening. In addition to seeing the studio and how movies were made, Carl even had demonstrations made by the special effects crews to show the guests in true form movie magic. Featured attractions were a Wild West stunt show, a simulated flash flood, and the destruction of a wooden bridge. If any of these sound familiar, it's because these would later become real parts of the studio tour and the parks in general. After this grand opening, Carl decided to keep allowing guests into the studio and even set up stadium-style seating so people could sit down, eat a lunch, and watch movies be made. They would charge 25 cents per admission, and this was successful for a very long time. This would all stop with the advent of sound and film, meaning that you couldn't have large audiences just watching you shoot a movie. They had to start building sound stages and start making things in a more controlled environment. For a couple years, there was no studio tour. This all ended in the late 1950s and 60s when Hollywood started reaching an all-time low. Universal began allowing bus companies, ones that would do like the Hollywood tours, to do rides throughout the studio that ended with a lunch at the commissary. This was great and an easy way for Universal to generate more revenue during a hard time, and Universal will also hand bus drivers scripts to read about the various facilities of the studio and even upcoming films for promotion. Then Universal would get purchased by MCA in the late 1950s, and in 1963, head of Universal and legend Lew Wasserman would ask to bring back the Universal Studio Tour as a permanent attraction. He would later hire creative director Barry Upson to lead the project, and hired many talented Hollywood creatives who have worked on some of the biggest films of all time come in and work on the design of the trams and the tour itself. Harper Goff, famous art director on Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, would create the iconic look of the trams, and Randall Dwell, art director of Singing in the Rain, would create the visitor center, which would act as a hub for guests coming in for a tour. The tram went through a couple of iterations before they would land on the glam trams that they created. This is that kind of classic studio tour look that you see in all those ads. The creation of these tram vehicles wasn't necessarily easy either. They had many times where they would try to do test runs with secretaries and the trams would just straight up break down. Despite all of these issues, the tour managed to open on June 17, 1964. Guests would have to purchase a ticket from a trailer on Lankershim Boulevard, and once they arrived at the tour center, they would board the glam tram and take a 90-minute tour of the studio with a lunch break at the commissary. And they would also have a makeup show, giving guests a look into the world of movie makeup. The tour was a smash hit, and the studio reported over 38,000 guests in the first year alone. This would lead Universal to add the first extension of the tour, the Prop Plaza, which would add a new Wild West stunt show and a demonstration showing how they showed driving in the movies. The tour at this time had grown in such popularity that they were having a hard time coping with the amount of demand. This led Universal to make a deal with Caltrans to remove a large hill on the Universal property to build a new and improved, larger visitor center. This would later become what we know as the upper lot area of Universal Studios Hollywood. They would then expand the tour in 1963 when they added the flash flood scene, which is still used in the park today. And not gonna lie, it kind of hasn't changed that much since then. The flash flood demonstrates how filmmakers can simulate different weather environments. The tram approaches a small village in the Mexico sets. They first demonstrate rain by using overhead sprinklers to spray down onto the street's village. They talk about how this similar technique is used in movies still today. They simulate a thunderstorm through flashing lights and sound effects, and the fake weather soon starts to get progressively worse when they announce that too much water is filling up the set. This is where a large rush of water races down the hill towards the tram, just barely missing it, and still managing to keep the guests dry. It's honestly a really cool effect, and the way that it looks like you're about to be soaked only for the water to rush perfectly underneath the tram is incredibly cool. Later in 1973, the parting of the Red Sea experience would open. On this stop, the tour would drive through Park Lake, the lake from Creature of the Black Lagoon and Psycho, and using large walls and drainage systems, parts the Red Sea. It used this really cool effect where it kind of drains the lake and has these large walls come up so that the tram has like a clear path to pass through. And it was based on the 1956 film The Ten Commandments and lasted all the way until 2016. The tour was able to plus these experiences over time, kind of making them make a little bit more sense to what was going on in modern times. Like, I think the last time I saw Parting of the Red Sea was themed around the Peter Jackson's King Kong movie, which was pretty cool as well. The last of these expansions was the collapsing bridge, and it was kind of the more lackluster out of the two. The tram would attempt to cross over a bridge, then timber would fall off them, causing the bridge to collapse slightly, tilting the tram forward, and that was pretty much it. The bridge would then reset and the tram would drive away. It was pretty much constantly broken and was sadly retired in 2014, and it still lays abandoned in the studio to this day, right next to King Kong 360 3D. When I was a kid, I'd always look at this and wonder what it was, and it was only until I, started doing my own research that I figured out it was actually a thing. But apparently a couple years back, people were still going on it, like it worked. So I don't know what's going on with this. I don't know why they haven't just taken it down, but I'm kind of glad they haven't, because it is a really cool piece of the studio tour's history, and driving past it is kind of eerie. It's like overgrown, it's over water, it looks like this dilapidated bridge. It's pretty cool. So I don't know. Yeah, collapsing bridge. This same year, they would also unveil the burning house, which is a facade of a house with fires shooting out of the windows, and that's pretty much it. After this, they would then soon open a very short-lived stop, which was the Rock Slide Experience, where guests got up and close and personal with basically what looked like flying meatballs. Located under where the Simpsons ride is now, guests would approach a mountainside where meatball-looking rocks would fly at them during the tram, and going under it similar to the flash flood, but with balls. The rock slide would only last until 1978 and get replaced by something much more exciting. The next following year, Universal was on a roll in the 70s. They would add the Runaway Train Experience, which was located in Six Points, Texas, the kind of Wild West set on the lot, and the tram would basically stop on a railroad where the train would almost hit you, just stopping right before it does. They got rid of this sometime in the 80s, but like most past studio tour attractions, you can still see it abandoned to this day. That train's just sitting there. So, if you're ever going through the Wild West set and you see a train that looks like it could cross over some tracks, that is probably the train from the 70s and 80s. The next thing that Universal would add would become kind of like a finale to the studio tour, and then would eventually be rethemed so many times that it was almost unrecognizable from what it was before. This was the Ice Tunnel, also officially known as the Doomed Glacier Expedition. Basically, long story short, the tram would then drive through this kind of abandoned Arctic looking research base, and once entering inside this glacier, you'd be caught up in an avalanche. The way they would do this is through like a spinning tube that would rotate around the tram, kind of making everyone on the inside incredibly dizzy, and they would just have like a big ice looking wall spinning around you with flashing thunderstorms and stuff like that. The whole idea is that the tram is caught in an avalanche and is like falling down the hill. See more of what they do with this later, but for right now, yeah, it was kind of silly, but people really liked it. It was very popular. So, Doomed Ice Expedition, very cool. In 1976, a year after Steven Spielberg's smash hit Jaws, Universal would capitalize on the new, extremely hyped IP with the Jaws experience. Besides the shark and some added fire effects, this has remained mostly the same since the 60s. You approach on a dock and watch someone get pulled over. They build tons of suspense until the animatronic shark flies out of the water while scaring guests. At the time, I could see this being absolutely terrifying, and it's kind of funny to see, what the original sharks looked like as they were going through, many stages of the history of audio animatronics. The shark has kind of only gotten better. It seems like it's kind of stayed the same since like the early 2000s and like 90s and stuff. Right now, you never know, we might get a new Jaws shark eventually. That would be really cool, like if they made it really scary. During all this Jaws hype, guests could go actually look at the real animatronic shark from the movie up on the upper lot, which was really awesome. I wish I could have seen that. The last stop they added in the 70s was the 1979 Battle of Galactica, replacing the rock slide experience we talked about earlier. The Battle of Galactica was incredibly impressive for the time. I know nothing absolutely at all about Battlestar Galactica, so I'll try my best. But basically, you're captured by Cylons, who are like evil robots, and they take the tram into their spaceship, which was a highly impressive set filled with static and animatronic figures, where they were gonna like kidnap you or like hurt you or something because you're like a captain or some kind of hero. But before they can eventually torture and kill you, you're saved by a gallivanting hero, and of course the tram escapes. Experience both used live actors and multiple practical effects and animatronics to help bring something that really wasn't done at the time. The Battle of Galactica surprisingly lasted incredibly long as well, up until 1992, when it would then get replaced in order to prepare for the Back to the Future ride. At this point, the Universal Tour was jam-packed with offerings for guests, and they kind of took a break with adding stuff for a while, like almost a decade. But boy, would it be worth the wait when in 1986, Universal unveiled the King Kong experience to the world. Based off the 1975 film, the Kong experience would take place in a giant soundstage and house one of the most impressive audio animatronics I think I've ever seen in my entire life. After driving through the New York street, the tour guide would inform riders that they were entering a closed-off soundstage, which had a New York street set, kind of like nighttime vibe going. Incredibly detailed. I still think about this to this day. I was a child and it was incredible. Tram would pass over a bridge through a very detailed suburb when you see a TV burst into life with a news report reporting of a large beast roaming around the city. We see a helicopter reporter report of a tram load of people in danger and that they need to get out of there, but of course she can't complete her sentence when the report cuts out and the helicopter falls right in front of us. Like, we literally see a helicopter prop fall. The helicopter falls right next to the tram. Some power cables, they burst into flames, and the driver pulls ahead and warns guests he sees something, and it's Kong, which is a large 30-foot tall, 7-ton Disney Imagineer Bob Gurr designed animatronic. It is incredible. The Kong animatronic is holding onto the bridge, shaking it as the tram stops nice and slowly in front of it so that everyone can get a smell of his banana breath, and then the tram just drives away. This experience was probably one of the best things Universal had for years. Super well themed, incredibly impressive experience. It was incredibly terrifying for me. This made the studio tour such a scary experience for me as like a 5-year-old. We'll talk about this a little later, but sadly this experience would burn down in 2008 when a backlot fire would rip through Universal, sadly burning down a lot of film history with it. A few years later, in 1988, Universal would add another one of the bigger additions to the tour, which was Earthquake, which would attempt to simulate an 8.3 on the Richter scale earthquake. The tram drives onto a soundstage that would mimic a subway station in San Francisco, where the tram stops with the tour guide talking all about set design or something related. The tour guide is then cut off by the start of shaking and the whole subway kind of going into haywire. Things are falling off shelves, signs are falling. At one point, a door shoots open and electricity is shooting out of like a broken generator. A train car tries to pass through the tunnel and it derails, almost crashing into the tram. The ceiling begins to crack and a giant gasoline truck slides down and almost crashes into you. And then the water main breaks, sending a bunch of water rushing through the station. It's incredibly overstimulating. All of these elements kind of going off all the time, like fire, electricity, ceiling cracking, and a whole gasoline truck coming towards you are incredibly impressive and extremely complex. And it's really cool that this is still around today and we still get to experience it. Sadly, Universal Orlando doesn't get to have this anymore, so it's one of the, special kind of nostalgic things that we still have. Another long break would happen in between openings of anything new on the studio tour, but this would all change when the ice tunnel would be rethemed around Dante's Peak. And was it like a mine shaft? So I had a hard time finding pictures of any of this, but my guess it was kind of the same idea, but kind of instead of ice, it was fire and you're like in some kind of earthly mine volcano kind of thing. Studio tour then also get no further updates until the year 2000, when the trams themselves would get an update with LCD monitors, DVD playback, and brand new JBL sound systems. The next update would come in 2001 when the Dante's Peak fire tunnel would be replaced with the Curse of the Mummy's Tomb to tie in with the popular Brendan Fraser mummy movies. God bless. Seriously, oh my god. This, like all of the other tunnel experiences, were pretty much the same, just a change in theming. And this would be set, of course, in an Egyptian tomb where the walls would kind of just circulate around you. This was definitely Universal dipping their toes in for the up-and-coming Revenge of the Mummy ride that would be coming out a couple years later. Nothing much except for small and normal movie promotions were really added to the tour. This thing would be the Fast and the Furious up-close dancing car gasolina experience. The next biggest news to happen would happen on June 1st, 2008, when a massive fire broke out on the backlot at 4:55 a.m. in a chapel on New England Street. The fire would spread and soon begin to destroy a good portion of the New York street sets and the New England street with it. And luckily, the Back to the Future clock tower was spared, so thank God. The only thing that really wasn't spared was the King Kong experience, which was a huge loss for the studio, and of course New England Street and most of the New York streets. This would be a huge loss not only for the studio, but the park itself. The fire was believed to be caused by faulty fire sprinklers after workers were working on one of the chapel's roofs with welding tools. They waited around an hour to see if any fires happened, which is apparently the normal way of doing things, and due to the alarms not being triggered, they figured all was well. The fire was noticed by a security guard, and by the time the Universal firefighters were on the scene, a whole block of facades was already up in flames. The fire took over 400 firefighters to put out and was one of the worst incidents in the studio and park's history. Luckily, no one was seriously injured, but it was complete chaos over Universal on June 1st, 2008. A bulldozer tried to clear a path and accidentally ran over like a propane tank or something and set off a small explosion. It was just pure chaos. This would cause Universal to start scrambling to try to find something quick to add to the studio tour to, kind of have something, due to the fact that a major part of the studio backlot burnt down. So Universal would turn to the now defunct collapsing bridge and try to fix it up really quickly for one last and final run. Universal would get quick to work on rebuilding most of the backlot sets and trying to find a replacement for that classic Kong attraction. The reconstruction of New York Street was a huge construction job and would end up being completed in 2009, a whole year after original fire originally broke out. Because so much of Universal is still used as an actual studio today, those New York sets were really important for them to build, so they really focused their efforts more on that first. Next was the priority of replacing that Kong attraction. The only problem would be that the 3D trend of the 2010s would be trickling far into the theme park world, so Universal decided to retheme a fully immersive set, huge special effects and animatronics, with a shaky 3D experience. At the time, I remember this being kind of hyped by the general public, and people were actually really excited to go back to Universal to check it out. Universal will team up with the director of the 2005 remake, Peter Jackson, and using his team at Weta Digital, they would produce a ride film and help develop the experience. The whole theme around the experience would be taking guests through Skull Island and an encounter with dinosaurs and King Kong. So basically, you would have to hold on to your 3D glasses for the whole tour, and then you would eventually go into this room with very large 3D screens, which at the time I think broke some kind of record for how big a 3D screen would be, and they would play this fun little action scene where you were chased by dinosaurs and ultimately saved by Kong. The coolest part of this whole experience is the smells, to be honest, and that one part where the fake CGI tram full of tourists gets thrown into like the abyss, like they die, which I think is crazy. Other than that, it's the same usual 3D simulator crap that Universal has basically been doing for over a decade, and they are kind of starting to finally move away from. Today, the experience needs a much needed revamp. It looks horrible. The screen projector and like the actual quality of everything has just gone down a lot. It seems like everything's just kind of fading away. It's really weird. Another revamp this year would also be for Grinchmas, when Universal would retheme our favorite spinny tunnel and make it the Grinch cave, which must have been super uninteresting because I literally haven't found any photos or any like actual evidence of it existing besides people saying that it was there. So it was there. The Grinch cave was there. And again, no changes would come to the tour until 2011, when they would add a new host to the video portion of the studio tour. There's actually been video hosts for a while. I just thought it would be easier to go through them separately. So from 2000 to 2006, the tour was hosted by Ron Howard in brief scenes, kind of interlapped, very similar to how they did it with Jimmy Fallon. And in 2007, Whoopi Goldberg would become the new tour host and would add small comedic bits to each stop of the tour. And then for some time before 2011, they would drop Whoopi for Carson Daly related video clips, but he definitely wasn't like a host. They didn't make this officially for the studio tour. This would all change when Universal took the idea of host very seriously, adding tons and tons of Jimmy Fallon clips to the video tour. There was a bit for almost every section of the studio tour, so if you like Jimmy Fallon, that's great, but if you're not a big fan of him, this got old incredibly fast, taking away, actual tour from the tour and focusing more on just Jimmy Fallon making goofy jokes. Luckily nowadays, it's very rare you see any of the Jimmy Fallon stuff come up on the tour. They use way less of the videos throughout. Like I hardly ever see it, but Jimmy is still a part of the studio tour and we will never escape it. Again, we had another break until 2015 and the tour would get another edition. And if we thought Kong was bad, we would get something so much worse. The Fast and the Furious Supercharger was open in June and was the final nail in the coffin for the spinny tunnel. Thank God. But honestly, I think we got something much worse. But this soon became Universal's most laughed at attraction, and I want to reserve this for its own video in the future, but I'll briefly describe the concept. Guests are on the tour and are brought into Dominic Toretto's special hideout, which he invites us into because the bad guy is trying to get us. This leads to a high-speed chase through PS3 graphics LA. We see this very poorly CGI'd fight scene kind of take place. The studio actually got all the actors to reprise their roles for this, and it might be the worst part of the tour. If you thought King Kong is bad, this is the worst version. While King Kong had the masters at Weta, this one did not at all and was borderline Uncanny Valley. The Universal tour has influenced a lot of attractions that go into Universal Orlando, with most of the stops being devoted to full-blown rides, and eventually Universal will try to do this with the Fast and the Furious Supercharger section and maybe make one of the worst rides at any theme park. And again, I want to save that for a separate video. The next and final edition would be added in 2022, with the whole Juniper's Claim set from Nope becoming a new stop on the tour. This is exactly why people like the tour, and I think this is a great move for Universal. Seeing the exact set from a movie like Nope with cool added lighting effects and sounds kind of brings us back to the original roots of the studio tour, and actually engaging people with how films are made and getting to see stuff from movies that you love. The studio tour is probably one of the most influential theme park attractions of all time and gave birth to Universal as we know it. I only hope in the future that Universal really spends some time developing and adding new additions and fixing up old ones. The studio tour is really due for a facelift, and going through its history is crazy to see how much focus moved away from the tour as Universal Studios Hollywood has kind of developed as the theme park. All in all, I love the studio tour. It is such a big part of my childhood and what really made me fall in love with movies and want to pursue that in my life. A huge toast to the studio tour. It is incredibly awesome and has a long spanning history going back to the very beginnings of the Hollywood studio system. So I love the studio tour so much. I just wanted to share this with you guys, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Please like, comment, and subscribe below for more stuff like this. I'm kind of getting back into the swing of things. But anyway guys, thank you so much, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.